Somebody asked a really good question on stories the other day about if they should be concerned that their sheep swallowed a copper bolus. And that's a pretty fair question because the answer could be yes or it could be no. But if it is yes, then it is very concerning. And I'm going to try to explain that within a couple minutes and we'll see how I do. So for starters, sheep, goats, llamas, and alpacas all require copper in their diet. A lot of people mistakenly think that sheep should not have any copper in their diet, but they actually do have a requirement for it. Copper is really important for all those species in terms of specifically building immunity against worms. So yes, all of those species do require copper. The issue is that they all require it at different levels, and sheep specifically have a much lower threshold for toxicity than those other species do. So they have a lower number in which if you surpass that number in your diet, you're entering into a toxic range. So to put some actual numbers behind this so that it's a little bit easier to understand, sheep require about 5 parts per million of copper in their diet. Goats require 15 to 20 parts per million of copper in their diet, and alpacas and llamas are right in the middle there, requiring about 10 to 20 parts per million. So they all have about the same range for deficiency. So if there's less than 2 parts per million of copper in the diet for any of those species, then they're going to have a copper deficiency and they will have immunity issues and parasite issues because of that. However, where it gets tricky, and this is what people always have questions about, is where that toxic value is. So in sheep, anything more than 25 parts per million of copper in the diet will cause a toxicity, and that toxicity is very often fatal. Whereas goats, for example, can tolerate over 230 parts per million of copper in their diet. So the difference there is quite staggering. Not only do they tolerate more copper, but they need more copper to be healthy. So there is a major difference there in how you should be feeding those two species. Camelids, or llamas and alpacas, are right in the middle. So their toxic number is about 60 parts per million. So where this answer gets a little bit more complicated than just a single number is sources of copper in that animal's world. They're not just getting copper from the minerals and the supplements that you're feeding them. There's also a level of copper in the ground that they're living on, which means that there's a level of copper in the hay that they're eating, and there's also a level of copper in the hay that they're eating. And there could also be copper in the grain that you're supplying them, the water that's coming out of your well, or any treats that you're giving them. So there are all sorts of sources for copper, and they're wildly different on every single property. They could also be different from location to location on a single property. Somebody's hay in one field, for example, might be 1,500 parts per million of copper, but on the other side of the property, the hay that they harvested from that field might be 10 parts per million of copper. So this is a pretty complicated answer, but if you start adding all of these different things together and comparing it to those specific numbers, you should be able to figure out how concerned you are. Now, if you want to make this issue even more complicated, you also have to think about other factors, like if you have a drought year, that could contribute to an imbalance of micronutrients or elements such as copper in the ground, the grass, and the hay that you're supplying that year. So in drought years, certain pasture plants can accumulate higher levels of different elements, and then all of the elements work differently amongst each other. They either neutralize each other or will cause a summation effect depending on the element. So for example, a high level of molybdenum or even zinc in the diet can counteract a level of copper. So these are all things that you have to factor in to whether or not you should be afraid of a copper toxicity. But like I said in the beginning, if you are in a toxic range, it is likely fatal. And the tricky thing about diagnosing a copper toxicity is that it has something I like to call an acute on chronic effect. Acute on chronic basically just means that the liver and the kidneys have been sequestering and trying to mitigate this toxic level of copper for months and months, or potentially even years. And the liver's been able to depot all of this and almost like deal with it, but it reaches a point where it can't store any more copper, and then it tips you over into an acute toxicity. So these can be tricky to catch because you'll be doing monitoring for a very long time and you'll never really know when it's going to sneak up on you. The other thing is there's no great pre-mortem tests for copper. For example, there's no reliable or accurate blood test. Really, the only way to test for it is on a post-mortem using organ tissues like kidney or liver. So to cap off that question, copper boluses do come in different sizes. There's a different gram amount in each size. So depending on which size bolus that sheep swallowed and then what other sources of copper are in the environment, this owner should be either a little concerned or a lot concerned, but either way, it is concerning. There might not be a reason to panic, but you do have to examine all other sources of copper and you have to think about the size of bolus that they swallowed.